I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about economy money flows and probably end up asking the question, where's the beef? And what that means, you'll probably understand in a few minutes. Well, hopefully anyway. There are numerous misconceptions or faulty perceptions about the economy, which would be okay, except that many of those faulty perceptions about the economy are in the heads of policymakers who are making policy that is definitely not making the situation better for the majority. Admittedly, it's probably making the situation much better for a few, but definitely not for the majority. So let's look at some relationships that I've pondered for a while that brought me to ask a rather annoying question. At least I find it rather annoying. The government spends money into the private sector in terms of contracts it lets to companies or social programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, numerous ways that it spends money into the private sector. It collects money from the private sector in terms of taxes and licenses fees for different various and sundry things. Though the money that's in the private sector that comes from the government cycles back to the government, and there is also an interaction with the foreign sector, so that the private sector imports things from abroad and has to pay for them. So it makes payments. So money flows from the private sector to the foreign sector. And at the same time, the private sector exports things to the foreign sector so that the foreign sector makes payments to the private sector. And sometimes this balances and sometimes it doesn't. Though for the US, for quite a few years, there's been an imbalance where our imports have exceeded our exports to a rather substantial amount. In addition to this, the government actually sends payments to foreign sectors in terms of foreign aid programs that it provides, the money that it spends overseas because of U.S. bases that are scattered around the world, embassies in different locations. So in numerous ways, the government spends money into the foreign sector. And it also sells things to the foreign sector in terms of outdated, outmoded military hardware and technology and various and sundry things, so that it gets money from the foreign sector. So we have an array of exchanges that go on between the government, the private sector, and the foreign sector. Now, the government isn't allowed to spend money that it doesn't have. When we went off of the gold standard in 1971, Congress neglected to remove the statute that said the government can't spend money that it doesn't have. And in the summary section, there's a very interesting article by Firestone about why the national debt is Congress's fault, which I would recommend that you read. So if the government doesn't have money that it wants to spend for whatever programs it's pursuing, it has to borrow money, which creates the national debt. And the concept is that at one point in time, somewhere, that debt ought to get repaid, though that's sort of a pipe dream in that I'm not sure that any of the debt has been repaid since after the Second World War. In addition to that, and the current national debt is somewhere around $19 trillion. In addition to that, the private sector often wants to spend money that it doesn't have. So it borrows it from different lending organizations with the understanding that it has to be paid back at some point in time, with interest, of course. So we have a whole set of interacting flows of money, and with a national debt of $19 trillion and a private debt that's probably about twice that, the total debt in this set of flows with regard to the U.S. is somewhere around $60 trillion. Though the economy itself is not extremely healthy. So might it cause one to ask, where the hell is the $60 trillion? Because it's not actively engaged in making the economy well, but it must be somewhere. And if currently the government has to borrow money to pay the interest on its debt, meaning the national debt is simply getting worse, and Congress keeps talking about the government not doing deficit spending, and if it didn't do deficit spending, what kind of an impact would that have on the economy? Would it in fact simply result in the private sector having to incur more debt than it does at the moment? So what I think is a real interesting question that I don't see anybody asking is, where's the money? There's $60 trillion in debt, but it sure isn't bolstering the economy, but it must be somewhere. Look forward to your comments about this, and I'll see you in another perspective soon.